So, shared ownership, good idea or not? Hi, I'm Manda Walker, I'm the mortgage coach, and today I'm going to talk to you about shared ownership. I've quite a few clients, first time buyers, trying to get onto the property ladder, and they always ask about share ownership, help to buy, right to buy. So today I'm going to be talking about shared ownership. Now, what shared ownership is, in a nutshell, is you own a percentage of the property and you rent the other percentage. So, for example, you can own between 25% and 75% on your first purchase, and then what you will do is you will rent the rest of it. So, for instance, if you purchase a 25%, then you will rent 75%, and if you buy 75%, then it will be the 25% that you'll rent, or if it's 50-50, or any in between. So the minimum you can purchase on the first is 25%, and the maximum you can purchase is 75% on the first initial part. The next thing you can do is you can purchase more portions of it, which is staircasing, which I'll come back to. Now, the things to understand about shared ownership is it's always related to a housing association, and it's the housing association that you're buying it from. Now, in this situation, there are certain criteria. For example, you have to be over 18. If you are based in London, then your maximum household salary is 90,000. When I say household, if there's a couple who are living there and they're both going to be buying the property, they cannot have more than 90 as their annual salary. So, for instance, one of you can be on 50 and the other one on 40, and different scenarios, but it can't be more than 90,000. If you're not living in London, then it can't be more than 80,000. So if one of you is on 40, the other one can't be on any more than 40. Right, the other thing to be aware of is you cannot own another property. This must be, and when I say another property, I mean in the UK or abroad. This can be your only property. You could have owned before, but you can't own now. You can't have a mortgage anywhere. You can't have any rent arrears. You have to have very good credit. You can't have any CCJs, which is County Court Judgements. You have to have a good credit history. You have to have enough money to cover the costs that are involved in buying the property. Now, when you're buying a shared ownership, you are looking at buying a flat, which means that there will be service charge and ground rent. Now, when you're looking at that is one of the costs. So I think I'll start by talking about the disadvantages and then go on to talk about the advantages and then any criteria. So, firstly, as I said before, what you may consider a disadvantage is you can only you have to purchase between 25 and 75%. You can't purchase a lower amount if you have affordability issues and you can't afford a minimum of 25%. And the other thing is you can't buy more than the 75%. But then that begs to differ. If you can afford more than 75, then maybe you should just buy a property that isn't shared ownership and get the 100% right. The other thing, as I said, it will be leasehold, so you have to find out how many years on the lease. There will be a service charge that's due probably quarterly, and this will be linked to the housing association, and there will be ground rent. So I would recommend that you check what is the service charge and what is the ground rent. The next thing is you're restricted to the housing association rules, and it will be shared ownership only. Now, those are the disadvantages. The advantages, right, you get yourself on the property ladder. It's a lot easier. So if, for example, you're getting 25% ownership, you're purchasing 25%, then when you go to get a mortgage, if it's a new build property, you can get up to 95% a mortgage, 95% of it. If it isn't a new build and it's a standard shared ownership, then it is lower, 90% or less. But in that example, say you're buying a property that's worth £100,000, then the 25% share is worth £25,000. But if you're getting 90% mortgage, that means you only need a deposit of 10%. So you only actually need 2,500. Now that's a lot easier to save up than a bigger deposit. So that is also something to be aware of, which really, really does help, doesn't it? The next thing I wanted to talk about as an advantage is you can staircase. Now that is something to double check. The majority of shared ownerships you can staircase, but please read the fine print and I'll go on to the documents that you get and where you will see it. But not only can you staircase, ask to staircase, be it 5%, 10% increasing, but make sure you can staircase up to 100%, because I have had clients in the past that they could only go up to 95%, which means they will never own the property outright. The housing association will always own a percentage, and when you come to sell that property, it can make it quite difficult. And I'll go on to how you sell a shared ownership when you haven't bought them out, basically. The next thing I wanted to talk about is, even though there are a lot of lenders that will lend on shared ownership, so that's another advantage. And the thing I'd like to say about that is just be aware, either yourself or your mortgage advisor, whoever you're using, make them aware that it is shared ownership. The majority of lenders will have specific shared ownership products. Some will let you have the standard residential products. You just have to ask the question and find out whether you can do a standard one or not. The rates are pretty much the same from shared ownership to a normal residential. You're not being penalised for buying a shared ownership. So that is also an advantage. Another one is location. I know a couple of my clients have literally, they probably could afford to buy outright, but not in where in London they want to be. So this gives them the opportunity to buy in a really, really nice location. And as I said, make sure you could staircase up to 100%. And then that's what they're doing each year. In fact, there are mortgages where you could get a 5-year fixed and then you could do a further advance where you staircase a little bit each year. So you could basically get a mortgage for 5 years. So you know the interest rate on the, say, 50% that you've borrowed. And then every year you can do a further advance on 5% and borrow a little bit more from the exact same lender, borrowing 5%, 5%, 5%, 5%. Maybe over the next 5 years, every single time. But that initial 50%, you already know what the rate is. The new further advances will be a slightly different interest rate depending on what it is in the market. But considering that's only 5%, will be on a higher rate, rather than you doing a 2-year mortgage and then having to remortgage the whole thing every time you want to get an extra 5%, and then the whole of the mortgage will increase by a higher percentage, rather than the first scenario where that 50% or 75%, whatever it is fixed, and then the further advance, so it's just the 5% or 10% that you're getting that particular year as an additional purchase, as additional borrowing, is increasing. If you've got any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll be happy to explain it in a bit more detail. The next thing I wanted to talk about is, so as I've mentioned before, about the shared ownership, you can borrow, 25%, 50%, whatever, and then if then you can have loan to value in some situations of 95%, some situations of 90%, some situations, depending on the lender, has to be between 80 or 85%. But it's a lot easier to get that deposit when you're only getting a deposit percentage of a 25 or 50%, as opposed to getting, when you're purchasing 100% of the property and you've got to find 10% of 100% of the property, rather than finding 10% of 25% of the property. So I hope I've made that clear. The next thing is with criteria, I've mentioned the ages and the salaries and all the other criteria that there are. The next thing I would say to look at is it new build or is it traditional? There is a difference with the rent. So the rent is meant to be obviously the balance of what you don't own, and it's meant to be capped at 3%, but you need to check that out from housing association to housing association. The next thing is as I said, check that lenders allow shared ownership, and then the documentation. So you have got the MOS, which is the Memorandum of Sale, and this should give you what percentage of the property that you're purchasing and what the purchase price is. Now, this documentation is very important, especially if you're going to a mortgage broker. You can provide them with that, and then when they're getting the mortgage for you, they've got that information. The next documentation is your terms and conditions. Within the terms and conditions, and it will basically tell you what you can and can't do, which again, that will be whether you can whether you can purchase up to 100% eventually through staircasing, which is buying piece by piece by piece, as we've discussed. It also should say what the service charge is, what the ground rent is. If it's a new build, it should also say what the council tax is going to be when it's finally finished building. Right, so that's basically what shared ownership is, the advantages, the disadvantages, and the criteria. Now, the one thing I did want to say very quickly is what to do if you haven't bought all of the shared ownership and you want to sell it. Now, as with in the first scenario where I said you had to you are buying staircasing, buying percentages, you will have to get the housing association to value the property because you do not own it outright. Now, also in that situation, if you're selling it, say you've bought 75% of it and you've decided you want to sell it now, you have to go back to the housing association first. They will value it and they will try and sell it on your behalf. They will find people that want also to buy shared ownership, and they will obviously just sell them your 75%, and the housing association will still keep the 25% and charge them rent. But if for some reason they cannot find a seller for you, and I think they've got up to 8 weeks to try and find a seller for you, if they can't do that, then it goes to open market. Now, the one thing with both situations, because the housing association is valuing it, you have to abide by the price that they give. So, for example, if it's going to open market, or even if it's going to someone else who also wants to go on the housing association scheme, then they have to honour that price. Now, if some reason they come in, say £10,000 less, you can still sell it to them, but you have to make up that £10,000. And who's got £10,000, right? Or if you then do it on the open market, what the housing association sometimes do is they will sell the whole property to that buyer. So they'll sell 100%, and obviously you'll get your 75% and they'll get their 25%, but the new owner will own 100%. So that is also a possibility. But for me personally, I think, if you have got a small deposit, you want to live in a really great location, it is worthwhile. But I will always say, and I've mentioned this a few times now, but I will always stipulate, one, make sure you know what the service charge and the ground rent is, and whether it's going to be doubling or, increasing, quite aggressively, or what's actually going to be happening with that. Find out what costs you have to cover within the service charge. Do you have to contribute to all the windows in the whole block being covered, or is it just your flat? That kind of thing is really good to know. And then if you can staircase and eventually own 100%, not 95, read that fine print, then it probably is worth it. It probably is worth it, especially if you've got a plan. If you've got, for instance, you're a graduate, you've got an okay salary or you're a professional graduate, something like that. Any situation where you know your salary is going to be increasing over the next few years and you can keep on purchasing and purchasing and purchasing the percentage, then it really is worth it. The other final thing I'd like to mention is cladding. Now, obviously, because of Grenfell and what happened there, there is a horrible disaster, and I feel for everybody. But there are still a lot of shared ownerships and other flats that have cladding. With that, you need an EW1S form. Sorry, an ESW1 form. And then because of that, that is just to cover you off for the cladding and who's going to be removing it, who's going to be maintaining it, who is going to be doing the works on the property if it does have cladding. Is the housing association responsible for those costs? Are you responsible for those costs? Now, the majority of lenders, they either won't touch you unless you've got that form, or unless you've filled out their equivalent form with all the answers. In other words, you'll probably need that form in order to fill out the lender's specific form. So that's what I'd like to say on shared ownership, and thank you very much. There is a lot to it. Please feel free to put questions in the chat and I will go over them and answer them all. So thank you very much for your time, and yeah, I'm Manda, and the Mortgage Coach.